Okay, so welcome everybody to our first session of the Latin American History Workshop of the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Natalia Sobrevilla Perea, and I am delighted to be joined today by my colleague Chris and by Ezequiel Adamovsky from Buenos Aires, from CONICET and UBA. And she's going to be in dialogue with him today, talking about his award-winning book, El Gaucho indómito, that was the recipient of the Premio Iberoamericano, awarded by the Latin American Studies Association, 2020, no?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you very much for being with us today. The book is in Spanish, but the conversation today will be in English. And the way we will do it is, first of all, just so you know, we are being recorded. And in a little bit, I will give Chris the microphone, and she will be talking to Ezequiel, and we will all go in mute. Those of you who want to continue to be visible can choose to do that or not. That's up to you. But then after around 20, 25 minutes, maybe a bit more, we will open for a Q&A session, which I will be looking after. You can raise your hand on the Zoom system, or you can write on the chat. I will be monitoring those, and I will be giving you the possibility to ask the question, and we'll have a Q&A session. The idea is that the whole session will last for around an hour. So with no further ado, Chris.
All right, great. It's nice to see lots of familiar names and faces on here. Thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks especially to Ezequiel for writing this wonderful book. I'm really looking forward to discussing it today. But before we start talking about El Gaucho indómito, we wanted to speak very briefly about a different book. Ezequiel, could you show everyone what you got in the mail today?
This just came out today. I just got my first copy 2 hours ago.
So this is Historia de la Argentina. Yes. Everyone should, you know, if you're in Argentina, go to a bookstore and buy a copy. If you're not in Argentina, I think there's information on how to get access to it on the Planeta Editorial website. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
But our kind of primary focus here today will be on Ezequiel's previous book, El Gaucho indómito. And I know there are a lot of people on here who probably read Martín Fierro as children, but we also have a few students who may be less familiar. So I want to ask Ezequiel if he could start by just telling everyone, what is a gaucho?
Well, a gaucho is the Argentinian cowboy. It's the figure of the Argentinian horseman, which is both a historical character existing in the 18th and 19th centuries, and probably in the 20s also, but mostly an emblem of the nation, a symbol of the nation. Is the national character of Argentina. The national personification. It's as a character is a very strange one, for which it started by being in the 18th century a figure related to crime. It was a rustler, devoted themselves to stock theft. But in the 19th century, it became a symbol through a long process, which I explain in my book, and ended up being the national personification, which is strange because it has always been a rebellious character, mostly confronting the Argentinian state and arguing through their stories of rebelliousness, arguing that the law of the Argentinian state was basically unfair, and that the law of the Gaucho knife, the law of the Gaucho dagger was more fair than the original law of the state. So it's a complicated character to embody a nation. So my book is around the idea of how this peculiar and strange emblem became the emblem of a nation.
And as you talk about various ways of representing the Gaucho and explore some of these paradoxes of Argentine nationalism, you introduced what, at least to me, was a new concept, that is criollismo, a familiar concept, but you instead focus on criollismo popular, literally kind of popular creolism or popular celebration of the Creole. Could you elaborate a little bit on that concept?
Well, yes, there's two words in that expression. Criollismo refers to, in my definition at least, to a way of talking about the Argentinian people and therefore talking about the Argentinian nation through the image of the Gaucho, sometimes through the very voice of the Gaucho, like using the tone and the way of speaking of Gaucho, which is a plebeian, rural kind of Spanish, using that voice, or sometimes simply referring to Gauchos as a way to speak about the nation. It's a tradition also composed and made by images, characters, particular Gauchos with names and stories of their own. So that would be criollismo, and there have been many different uses of criollismo along the Argentinian history. My book focuses on what I call popular criollismo, which is criollismo used by lower classes or circulating among the lower classes, regardless of who was the author of those stories, as opposed to criollismo used by the elites or state officials for nationalistic purposes, which there was a lot of that also, but there are many other books referring to that. So I wanted to focus on the lower class uses of the criollismo.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that was interesting to me about this concept and the way you develop it is the emphasis you place on sort of the ambiguity of the term criollo in 19th century Argentina and in 20th century Argentina, and perhaps even up to the present day. So I wonder, do you think, does that ambiguity kind of depend on the audience, on the context? How do you kind of trace that?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the audience. Argentinian nationalism and the cult of the Gaucho revolves around the idea that there is something particularly authentic and relevant and important in being a criollo, whatever that means. But there's as you say, a lot of ambiguity of what a criollo means, and also which kind of bodies are meant to represent criollousness, if I can say that. So the very term criollo, as you probably know, from the very beginning was racially ambivalent. It was used initially to refer to people of African descent being born in America, and then it was used for any kind of person born in America. In the 19th century, it still retained its ambivalence, sometimes referring to mixed breed or people of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, and sometimes just referring to people being born in the country as a synonym of Argentinian. So that ambiguity played a significant role in struggles over the definition of who is to be Argentinian, who is to embody the Argentinian people. And criollista literature played a big role in that debate. That's one of I think the key contributions of my book, showing that the cult of the Gaucho sometimes referred to a Gaucho being of solely, exclusively Spanish origins, but sometimes referring to Gauchos as mostly people of dark skins and mixed origins, sometimes related to indigenous people and sometimes even to African Argentinians.
Yeah, I think for me, this kind of stress that you place on the ambiguity of the term is a really kind of historiographically interesting and insightful point. You know, we have other scholars like Gastón Gordillo, for example, who point out how these terms are kind of subtly racialized even up to the present day. But this idea of ambiguity and the kind of strategic uses that people might make of that ambiguity is an interesting thing to think about. And I guess there's also a connection there to work that you've published elsewhere on the idea of morocha, la morocha argentina, as being also a kind of ambiguous term. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes, yeah. Well, this book is actually part of the wider project I'm working in, which is to understand how racial distinctions and ethnic distinctions shaped class identities in Argentina. I first came to this issue when I wrote my book on the Argentinian middle class, the history of Argentinian middle class, in which I noticed that narratives of middle-class identity revolved very much about the idea of being the offspring of immigrant grandparents coming from Europe, and also the torchbearers of progress in Argentina, and how that narrative combined with narratives of national identity, also revolving around the idea of Argentina being a white European country. So my next step after that was trying to understand how those narratives, which had an obvious racist assumptions, how those narratives affected lower class identities. So when I started to do my research on this topic, I very quickly realized that issue was not dealt with openly in verbal language until very recently. So we don't have historical documents openly referring to differences of color among lower classes and how those classes dealt with that issue. Firstly, because lower classes generally don't leave much written documents, but also because that was a matter that was not supposed to be discussed in public until very recently. So for a long time, I tried to understand how to tackle this problem in the archive with the documents I had. And I realized that issue was not dealt with openly and in verbal language, but was actually very much debated in oblique ways through cultural consumption, forms of consumption, and cultural performances. And criollismo popular was the first expression of these oblique strategies to deal with the issue of race in Argentina. So I ended up writing a whole book about criollism without having the plan to do that at the beginning. So that was my first step in a wider project. Now I'm working on the history of Carnival. In Carnival celebrations, there was much implicit struggles and performances of race, which I think it's illuminating of how this issue was dealt with in Argentina.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked a little bit about the kind of challenges with finding the right kind of sources to study these dynamics related to race and ethnicity in Argentine history. Do you think there are any other challenges or obstacles to writing and talking about race and ethnicity in an Argentine context?
It was very difficult at the beginning. When I started with this issue, you know that Argentina has a problem with race in general, because it's meant to be a white European country with no other races, and at the same time people are awfully racist all the time in public discourse. So but most Argentinians used to think that racism and race differences played no role whatsoever in our past or our present. So at the beginning it was difficult, even in academic contexts, to raise this issue. Nowadays it's beginning to be more acceptable as a topic of research among academics. It's still very much a difficult issue when you talk about this in the public sphere. A lot of people get really angry and believe that you are bringing agendas of northern countries with no relation to our realities.
Yeah, I feel like there are certain terms that kind of are implicitly associated with a comparative analysis, and race seems to be one of them in some conversations about Argentine history. So even if you want to use that term to study a very specific and local reality, it can be sometimes difficult to make clear how you're using the term and what you're studying. Yeah.
Definitely.
Could you say a bit about how regional identities play into that dynamic of race and class that you were just describing? You
mean regional within Argentina?
Within Argentina, yeah. So the interior versus the province of Buenos Aires, and maybe the Northwest versus other parts of the interior?
Mm-hmm. Well, the struggle over the definition of who is to embody the Argentinian nation were very much part of the Gaucho cult, as I said. But as the Gaucho was a criollo and the rest of the country was meant to be also part of this Gaucho nation, there were also struggles as to where the Gaucho belongs to. So initially, Gauchos were only a reality of the province of Buenos Aires and Uruguay and the south of Brazil. There were no Gauchos in the mountains in Argentina or in Patagonia or elsewhere. But throughout the 20th century, there was a very interesting enlargement of the idea of Gaucho, so that finally most provinces could claim to have the Gauchos of their own, or criollos / Gauchos of their own. So there was while the Gaucho became the national emblem, there were also, let's say, local appropriations of this character. And there are also local forms of the Gaucho cult with characteristics of their own, mostly in the northwest of the country, particularly in the province of Salta. They have a very old tradition of celebration of salteñones, the Salta identity, which revolves around the idea of the Gaucho, the Güemes. Güemes was one of the heroes of Argentinian independence, and his horsemen fighting for independence were converted into an emblem of the Gaucho, competing with the Gaucho of the province of Buenos Aires, associated with it, but also competing for legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you talk about how this is essentially a masculine enterprise, that the Gaucho himself is male, the women in these kind of texts and other cultural productions are mostly silent, most of the writers and singers are male. And I wondered whether this gender dimension that you identify has broader implications for our understanding of Argentine nationalism.
It does. It does. Definitely the popular criollismo in general was mostly or overwhelmingly a masculine enterprise. There were almost no women participating in this phenomenon. As authors, at least, we know very little about women as consumers of this phenomenon. We don't know to what extent women did participate as consumers, but everything points to the idea that it was mostly masculine enterprise. The Gaucho rebelliousness was had their own group of figures, counter figures, to which the Gaucho would rebel against. Mostly state officials, policemen, military, landowners, and urbanites in general. All of them male. So it was a conflict. The conflict of the Gaucho was always a conflict among men, involving notions of braveness, of courage, of masculinity. There was a struggle of the Gaucho to show his masculinity. And in many cases, the struggle involving Gaucho and the enemies was narrated as a struggle for a woman. So many of the stories, the dime novels that the lower class people consumed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, most of the stories were stories about rich people or military enemies trying to steal the Gaucho's wife, and the Gauchos fighting to recover that wife, or stories revolving those ideas. So it was a struggle for the appropriation of women. So as far as we know, there is nothing particularly Argentinian in that phenomenon. I mean, nationalistic views built around the idea of masculinity. So that's very common in other contexts as well. I would say, by comparison, that in Argentina, perhaps the masculine component is more present, and there is no comparative national personification of a women body in Argentina. Like, for example, I don't know, in the United States, you have Uncle Sam, which is also a masculine figure, but you also have Lady Freedom, or you have Britannia and John Bull in the UK, and Mother Russia for the Russians, and so on. There are many national personifications which embodied in female characters, and Argentina is totally masculine.
Yeah, we have on our schedule for later in the year, we're going to speak with Cecilia Tusunian, who I can see is here on the chat now, who's writing about the Chica Moderna, and it'll be interesting to compare those two, one of which is, as you say, kind of so, the Gaucho so kind of thoroughly embodied as a national symbol, but the Chica Moderna also a powerful and mobilizing symbol, perhaps not relating exactly to nationalism in the same way. But kind of some of the some of the observations that you've been making about the masculine aspects of this prompt me to ask you a question, which is actually from the introduction to the book itself. How can it be that our national hero is a resentful person with a drinking problem who kills his fellow citizen for no reason? So having written the whole book, what is your final answer to that question?
Well, it's very difficult to answer to that question briefly. That's the subject of the whole book. People need to know that the Gaucho emblem is not just a rebellious character, but it also is represented by one story in particular, which is the story of Martín Fierro, which became the national poem. In that story, Martín Fierro says once and again that the state is unfair, that the law of the state is unfair, that state officials are corrupt and pose violence to lower class people. So it's a very strange poem if you think of it as a national poem, because everything it says is that the state has no legitimacy, that the whole purpose of civilized life is pointless, because Martín Fierro ends up concluding that life in society is impossible, and he escaped to live among Aboriginal people. So it's a very resentful and sad poem. It's very difficult to understand how such poem would become a national poem. And national symbols are meant to be symbols of unity, inviting people to believe that we are all brothers and sisters, and inviting people to trust in the state. Martín Fierro does exactly the opposite, reminds us that we are divided and that we cannot rely and trust the state. So the most known aspect of this story was very well known through other books and research. We know that after 1913 there was a nationalist intellectual, Leopoldo Lugones, who first proposed the idea that the Gaucho and the poem Martín Fierro should be accepted as national symbols, and we know that the Argentinian state took that idea, accepted that idea in the early 1930s. So the Gaucho became a state, a cult to the Gaucho became sponsored by the state at that point. That was a very well-known story. What I wanted to prove and to show was that Leopoldo Lugones, when he proposed such a strange idea, he was just trying to maneuver on a fait accompli, on an accomplished tract. The Gaucho had already been embraced as a national symbol by the lower classes long before that. So there was no question whether to accept that symbol or not. The best thing that someone like Leopoldo Lugones could do was to try to rewrite the Martín Fierro as to be a symbol acceptable for the purposes he wanted to. And it was very problematic for him. It's pretty hilarious to see when for example, the military forces in Argentina started to use that poem for the nationalistic indoctrination in the 1930s. It was really complicated for them to explain why they would choose a deserter as someone that people should imitate. If you read Martín Fierro, he once and again says that Argentinian militaries are despicable in every possible way. So it was a really difficult choice, and I think that choice was illuminating of at least two aspects of Argentinian history that I wanted to highlight. Firstly, the extraordinary cultural and political productivity of the lower classes, how the lower classes in Argentina from the era of independence onwards managed to have a direct impact both in politics and in culture in Argentina. The very emergence of Gaucho poetry at the times of the independence is impossible to understand without taking into account that actual Gauchos were taking part in the fights for independence and played a major role there. And the second thing that I wanted to highlight was that Argentina is one of the countries in which the process of national formation acquired a peculiar path, not very common in other countries, which is that no narrative of national identity managed to become hegemonic. There are competing images of who the Argentinian people are and where they're going and where they come from. And the fact that we ended up choosing such a divisive emblem is indicative of this problem when it comes to defining what Argentina means for Argentinians.
The point you were making, the first of those 2 points about the cultural creativity of the lower classes, it reminds me of what was one of my favorite chapters in the book, this chapter that focuses on Martín Castro, who's this anarchist bricklayer and folk singer from Merlo and to the west of the city of Buenos Aires. Could you tell us a little bit about him and how you researched and analyzed his work?
Well, it was a surprising discovery for me. Martín Castro was a payador. Payador, for those who don't know what that word means, is a popular singer of the times before tango and before records. The first expression of commercial entertaining and singers in the cities singing for small audiences before microphones, before recordings. They were called payadores. They would use styles of singing coming from the rural areas of the province of Buenos Aires, combined with Afro-Porteño rhythms of the city of Buenos Aires, such as milonga. So there were quite a few of them in the late 19th century, early 20th century, making a career for themselves, singing in small places, small venues, theaters, circuses. Only a few of them became famous, and not more than 10, 15 of them managed to print their compositions, their songs, in popular and in cheap booklets. Martín Fierro was one of, Martín Castro. Martín Castro was one of them. A very interesting figure. He was of a very lower class origins. He never went to school. He learned how to write and read by himself while he was working as a peon in a rural area in the province of Buenos Aires. He became anarchist, and he was famous among lower class people and working class fellows of the city of Buenos Aires, although he never managed to record any of his songs, but he did leave 10 or 15 booklets with his songs. So he was a pretty unknown person. I just discovered him by chance when I was reading tons of cheap leaflets and booklets of criollista topics. And he was interested in that he presented by using the voice of the Gaucho, because he would write like Martín Fierro, using that plebeian rural style of speaking, which was his own, by the way, because he grew up as a peon in the countryside. He would build a whole counter history of Argentina in the 1920s narrated as a history of European gringos invading the country and exploiting the Gauchos / indigenous people, because for him the Gauchos were indigenous people, not even mestizos, not even mixed breed, just 100% indigenous people. So he managed to present a counter narrative of Argentinian history, stressing the fact that authentic Argentinians, that is Gauchos, were of indigenous background and therefore dark-skinned, at a time when no one else was saying that. There was no comparable statements or narratives in the academic life at that time, or the intellectual circles at that time. Those sort of ideas became popular among intellectuals in Argentina in the 1960s and 1970s. So it was very puzzling for me how this man with no formal education whatsoever came to such strange, peculiar definitions of Argentinian society, Argentinian nation, and how he could present this idea of a nation torn between an indigenous origin and a gringo white presence, not just from foreign people, but also Argentinian-born people of European background. So how he managed to present this vision in the 1920s before anyone else. In a way, he was like my Menocchio. So I used Carlo Ginzburg's book as inspiration as to how you can use a very peculiar, unique voice to illuminate an aspect of popular culture that didn't have many continuations at that time, but was, we can know that it was present through this unique, peculiar, incomparable voice of this payador.
Yeah, the example.
So I'm glad that you like that chapter. Yeah, it's probably my favorite also.
It's really interesting. I really recommend it to everyone. And I think that example and others like it raise interesting provocations about kind of how we study cultural history more broadly, and in particular also about what qualifies as intellectual history. That's another kind of interesting question that you raise in the conclusion. I think we should probably open it up for some contributions and questions from the other members of the seminar. Does that sound good, Natalia?
Yes, great. So I still haven't had any expressions of interest from either the chat, or maybe somebody would like to raise their hand. I'm kind of looking here. Anybody who would like to start with questions? Yes, Ernesto Seman, I don't know if you can unmute yourself, and I will unmute you. Yes. Thanks.
Did you unmute me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Ezequiel, for the talk and for the book. But I had a question related to the book. If you could elaborate a little bit more, as you say, and you wrote in the book, part of the intellectual operation that Leopoldo Lugones leads in the 1930s is to basically embrace what the lower classes had already done before. But I was wondering, and as you say, for obvious reasons, these lower classes, you can find sort of easy ways to explain the identification with Martín Fierro, with this kind of gaucho and a sort of a complicated relation with power and with the army and with hierarchies in general. But at the same time, and chronologically, sometimes before Lugones, also the elites come to reinvent Martín Fierro and sort of embrace the idea of the gaucho, not only in the province of Buenos Aires, but also in the interior. No? The case of Tucumán is one of those that are mentioned. So not only in relation to Martín Fierro, but in relation to the gaucho in general, I guess the question would be like, it's understandable why the lower classes did that. It's understandable the cultural operation of Leopoldo Lugones. Why do elites go towards the same, in some cases, towards the same path?
Well, it's an interesting question, because there is an older story of circulation of the Gaucho emblems between, let's say, the higher part of society and the lower part of society. As far as we know, the first expression of interest in Gaucho as an emblem happened at the times of the independence wars, when this phenomenon of the Gauchesca poetry of Gaucho poetry, was a very peculiar genre of written literature, but written by imitating the oral style of lower class rural folks. So this phenomenon, as far as we know, it's a phenomenon very peculiar of revolutionary times, as Josefina Ludmer explained long ago, only understandable as a point of encounter of higher class elites trying to mobilize the people for the cause of independence, and lower class people participating in a revolution in their own terms. So at that point, this very peculiar genre, not belonging either to the higher lettered city nor to the oral rural countryside, but to the point of encounter of both. That was the first moment in which the Gaucho became an emblem. At that point, an emblem of independence, presenting the voice of the people, commenting on issues of the war and issues of political actuality. So that was the first moment in which the Gaucho became a cultural symbol, so to speak. After that, we have a whole story of lower class uses of that symbol, responded by higher classes, higher class attempts to appropriate that symbol, and lower class new waves of manipulation of that symbol for their own. Adolfo Prieto showed very well that the young intellectuals of the Generación del 37, the people who were trying to invent a nation, I'm talking about the mid 19th century and before the 1930s, the 1830s, 1840s, those young intellectuals, they knew that if they wanted to build a nation, they needed a local literature, and to have a local literature, they needed local characters, characters peculiar to Argentina and only to Argentina. And Adolfo Prieto showed how those young intellectuals discovered the figure of the Gaucho by reading travel accounts of Englishmen visiting Argentina. English travelers who were imbued with the spirit of romanticism in Europe, also at home trying to look for rural folk characters to represent their nation. Those were the first intellectuals who discovered the Gaucho as a character with potential for poetic imagination and for literature. So Argentinian intellectuals learned about the Gauchos not by looking at the reality around them, but by reading Englishmen travel accounts. So ever since the mid 19th century, there were attempts by elites coming from the higher classes to use the Gaucho as a romantic character for national literature. Not yet as a national character, but as a character representing local authenticity, at least. So we have as you say, Ernesto, an older story of higher class attempts to use the Gaucho as a literary figure. Leopoldo Lugones was the first to propose that the state would embrace that figure and build a state-sponsored cult of the figure of the Gaucho. But he was not the first one to have interest in the Gauchos. So if the Gaucho ever became a symbol able to be used for that purposes, was because it was embraced by the lower classes ever since the time of independence. So there was a lower class audience paying attention to Gaucho stories well before lower class people learned how to read. So we know that stories of Gauchos and Poesía Gauchesca, the Gaucho poetry, were read aloud for lower class folks who couldn't read. So it became a very popular, unstoppable phenomenon well before any intellectuals of the higher class paid attention to Gauchos. So that there's a very long and interesting and complex story of circulation of this cultural symbol from the lower part of society to the higher part and back and forward through the 19th century until it became a national emblem.
Great, thank you very much, Ezequiel. We have a question from Thomas Robinson, who wrote it down on the chat. I don't know, Thomas, if you want to make your question orally or if you want me to read it out. We have Silvia Escanilla Huerta with her hand up, and Cecilia Sotozuin also with her hand up. So maybe seeing that it would be good to take a round of questions. So Thomas, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or would you like me to read it out? You could just type that quickly. Okay, you're happy for me to read it out. So Thomas's question is that you mentioned that historically the image of the Gaucho was exclusive to the Buenos Aires provinces, but previously I have heard locals in Misiones refer to the region as the Cuna del Gaucho. Is that just a latter myth, or is there any substance to the idea of the northeast of the country as the origin of the Gaucho? And then Silvia, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Ezequiel, for the talk. I have two questions. The first one is if you could elaborate a little more about the tensions between the Salteño Gaucho and the Buenos Aires or Pampas Gaucho. I'm curious about the bottom-up perceptions of these two Gauchos and how those two images compete, particularly the Salta one, which is interesting to me. And the second question is, have you find or do you know of similar bottom-up constructions of national identities, popular national identities like this in other parts of Latin America, or I mean, if you know, if you can compare, because top down they're very popular, but bottom up I would like to know if there are some things that are similar in other places.
Thank you, Silvia. And finally, Cecilia, if you could just ask your question, please.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I have one question that regards the gender dimensions of the nation, as we were talking about, and circulation. Circulation of this figure mostly in other parts of Latin America or South America. And basically, I was thinking that scholars tend to agree that tradition and cultural roots or uniqueness of the nation are generally embodied by female figures. So, and in Argentina, it's the contrary, no? I mean, a man embodies tradition and national identity. But this is very similar to what happens also in Chile with the Roto Chileno or the south of Brazil. So my first question is, do you see circulation of these images, or maybe these intellectuals that are thinking about how to create a national identity, and maybe talking with them, or I don't know, something like that. And second, if you don't see, like, if you can recognize a pattern in male incarnations of the nation in settler societies, like, I don't know, Australia or New Zealand, or even the US in a way with the cowboy, this image of the like a male conqueror of the land, that it's, you find it in other societies as well. So maybe, yeah, there are two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I will start by the last one. I don't know a lot about other national cases, so to give you a solid answer to your question. There is a commonality throughout the Americas in finding lower class male, mostly rural characters as embodiments of the people and the nation. You have the roto chileno in Venezuela. You have similar figures as well, and the cowboy, of course. I imagine, but this should require more research than I can provide right now. I imagine that settler societies, particularly in regions such as Latin America, in which the colonization was mostly, at least initially, a masculine enterprise of European men conquering lands, but also conquering and dominating women as part of that enterprise, explain why in these regions men are more likely to be taken as personifications of nations than in other experiences. But I don't know. This is just a hypothesis. In the case of Gauchos, it's interesting because nationalistic, nativist, what we call nativist approaches to Gaucho stories, this stemming from nationalists, mostly of the higher class, trying to use the Gaucho as a piece for nationalistic, more right-wing oriented cult. They would, for example, claim that the Gaucho was a descendant of Spaniards alone, with not being mixed with indigenous at all. So in the first museum with a room dedicated to Gauchos in Argentina, this was in the early 1930s. The written indications accompanying the figures of the Gaucho would say that the Gauchos would never mix with indigenous people. It's a very strange move, because it was obvious that the companion of the Gaucho was the China. The wife of the Gaucho was the China, and the very name of the China refers to someone, at least with mixed origins. So it was more complicated to accept that the male component of the nation was mixed than to accept that the women were mixed in the case of the Gauchos. That is indicative of this colonial origins of Latin American societies, I would say. But this is just hypothetical. This would require more comparative research, certainly. Comparison between Gauchos in Salta and Buenos Aires. There are many aspects of both cults in common, but there are also differences. Initially, in the northwest of the country, the local elites there tried to present ideas of Creoleness in opposition to the figure of the Gaucho, because the Gaucho was rebellious, was anti-state, was anti-elites, anti-urban people, anti-police, anti-military, and those elites didn't like that aspect. So there were different. They tried to present different characters of Criollo life, including some of them not being Gauchos at all, or not being referred to as Gauchos at all. And the cult of the Gaucho in Salta is very much associated with the cult of their local hero, the Martín Miguel de Güemes, the local hero of independence. So the cult of Gauchos there was mostly a cult of humble, brave, but obedient soldiers of the local hero. as opposed to the cult of the rebellious solitary gaucho in the province of Buenos Aires. Of course, they tried to create a sort of synthesis between those two figures, to claim that those two figures were the same, best represented by the gauchos of Güemes. And it's interesting that they found an actual empirical link between the province of Buenos Aires and Güemes, in that apparently this is what the daughter of José Hernández, author of Martín Fierro, said. José Hernández named his hero Martín Fierro as an homage to Martín Miguel de Güemes, the hero of independence of Salta. So there's a kind of genetical link between those two cults. We can also find in the case of Salta the same tensions when it comes to referring to ethnic backgrounds of the figure of the gaucho. Some of the elites of Salta claimed that Martín Miguel de Güemes was the heir of a totally, completely, 100% pure Spanish family, while others claim that he was mestizo himself. And there are interesting ethnographic studies of the cult of the gaucho in Salta today, which involve massive massive festivities in Salta every year. And they have found that while higher class traditional associations exalting the figure of the gaucho would present the gaucho as a Spanish character, lower class people participating in those celebrations would stress more the connection between the gauchos and aboriginal people of the region. So the same kind of tensions are still present to this very day. Gauchos in Misiones, well, initially the word gaucho was only, as far as we know, only used in the area of the Rio de la Plata, broadly speaking. That means the countryside of Buenos Aires and the countryside of Buenos Aires, Uruguay, and the south of Brazil. As far as we know, gaucho was only used there. At the time of the independence, it also started to be used in Salta, in referring to the gauchos, the Güemes. Apparently, the soldiers of Güemes came to be named as gauchos as a reaction against the way their Spanish enemies were calling them. So the Spanish enemies were calling patriots in Salta gauchos as a way to, as a pejorative appellative. And apparently gauchos in Salta, peasants in Salta, took up this name and inverted the moral condemnation and started to use that name as a name of pride. So at the time of independence, the name gaucho was only used in the area of Rio de la Plata and Salta, and then later on it started to spread to the rest of the country. We know, for example, one of the chapters of my book is about one folk composer called Buenaventura Luna, coming from San Juan in the mountains. And we have one of his writings in which he actually discussed how he could accept the gaucho as an emblem when in his own province, with the folk culture that he was trying to uphold and to promote, there were no gauchos whatsoever. It was an alien word for them. So, but at the end, he decided to name the natives of his own country gauchos because he was very attracted to Martín Fierro as a poem. So he thought that he could then rename peasants in his own province as gauchos, so as to enlarge the idea of gaucho and to make it emblem of criollos of the whole country. So the cult of gaucho expanded to the rest of the country as the gaucho became an emblem for the nation. I can't remember. There was another question. I think in
that round it was enough, but we do have some questions that David wrote down. I don't know, David, if you want to read them out or if you want me to summarize them for you. We don't have a lot of time, so if anybody else wants to make a question, please make yourself known or just write something. David? David, you have to unmute yourself. Yes,
Am I audible, Natalia?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Three very quick points, actually. I've read a lot of the British travellers in the early 19th century, and the man who is really the centerpiece for this whole discussion, romanticizing the Gaucho, is Francis Bond Head. The other ones were not very favorable at all, but certainly Head was. Second, I think the discussion, I felt the discussion sort of lacked a little bit in terms of the mid-19th century, when during the great civil war battles between federals and unitarios or liberals and so forth, the Gauchos were always at the forefront of so many discussions, especially in the context of rural revolts. The third question is, which I jotted down rather incoherently, actually, in my little memo. I don't know how to work this thing very well, but I'm unhappy with this notion of race, as Ezequiel puts it, as applied to Argentina. Not to say, of course, that there were no racial differences, but it's so very rare, actually, to find the discussion phrased in a racial context. Gauchos in the traditional narratives that I've read are always presented in a cultural as opposed to a racial form. And I suspect that this notion of race actually is a latter-day construct, actually, conceivably imported from elsewhere, which I'm simply unhappy with. And I wonder if Ezequiel had any comments to make any response to these things.
All right, so before you answer, Ezequiel, this is the last chance saloon. So if we don't have anybody speaking now, this will be the last question. Ezequiel, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David, for your questions, and I'll try to answer. Regarding the first one, yes, we didn't mention this in this conversation today, but the Gauchos as political figures, political emblems, were very much used after the times of independence and through the times of the war between the civil war between federals and unitarios and federales. Particularly the federales, they very much used and printed Gaucho poetry as a weapon for political, to rally the people around them, and they were very successful in that. They did publish quite a few gazettes with Gauchos speaking about politics and calling their fellow Gauchos to support the federal leaders. The Unitarios also tried to do the same in the 1940s, late 1930s and 1940s, with less success, but nevertheless they did produce quite an extensive body of literature revolving around Gaucho figures. So that was a prominent part of this story I'm trying to analyze in my book, definitely. Some of the contributions of the federal party were later recovered by writers of the criollista literature at the late 19th century and early 20th century. One of the aspects that I also worked in my book is that Gauchesca literature, criollista literature, was also very useful in presenting different heterodox narratives of the Argentinian history, opposed to the narratives that were being taught at school, particularly in the vindication of the federal caudillos, not so much of Rosas, but mostly of the federal caudillos, the late federal caudillos, particularly Chacho Peñalosa. So as the Gauchos were the rank and file and the fighters for caudillos, it was very easy to make this connection between the cult of the Gaucho and the cult of the federal leaders and popular criollismo did that well before revisionist intellectuals started to do that in the 20th century. There's a very interesting connection between the 19th and the 20th century in intellectual terms here. And as for the term race, it is true that in Latin America in general, and Argentina in particular, is not a concept that is easily accepted in scholarly debates. I myself, I use ethnic/racial identities to refer that we are not just dealing with the ethnic dimension, but also to issues such as the skin color, which is not necessarily comprised in ethnic definitions. It would be a long discussion, but I don't think that when we use the word race or racial only and necessarily defines or is only defined by the genetic scientific aspect of it. There is an interesting discussion presented by the French historian Jean-Frédéric Job, who claims that we can find racism as far as the 14th century or 15th century in Europe, and he defines racism as any claim that that moral or mental characters are transmitted from parents to children by physical humors, being blood, milk, or whatever means that would be. And there is much of that in Argentinian history. There's not racism in there was, of course, but it's not widespread. The version of local racism is not predominantly the genetic scientific version that you can find in other countries, but there are assumptions that certain traits of the local population are transmitted from parents to children somehow in some forms of biological process. So I do think it's relevant for the Argentinian culture and Argentinian history to bring this concept and this discussion. Of course, taking into account that racial hierarchies or ethnic racial hierarchies are not organized in Argentina in a way that is comparable to the United States or other places. It's completely different. It needs completely different tools and concepts, but nevertheless, I do believe that ethno-racial distinctions are an important issue in Argentinian history.
Great, thank you so much, Ezequiel. Ben Bryce has also mentioned that raza was all over the 1895 census, so thanks for that. And there's just a last one, if you would indulge us, Ezequiel, from Muradille, thanking us. And she'd like to ask if Borges, if you have anything to say on Borges's and Bolaños' Gaucho characters.
No, Bolaños is absolutely not mentioned in my book. Borges is, however, I have to remind you that my book is not about criollismo, in the whole phenomenon of criollismo that focuses only on popular criollismo. So I deliberately try not to engage in discussions of how respectable writers and intellectuals and so on would use the emblem of the Gaucho. Borges is mentioned because he was very interesting in that he, as a young man in Buenos Aires in the 1920s and 30s, he was very much attracted to criollista literature. His early contributions which revolve around the idea of the orillero, the compadrito, which is the urban counterpart of the rural Gaucho. I mean, the rebellious suburban Argentinian man, courageous, fighting with his knife with other men and so on. Borges was very much attracted to that literature. The very journal that he and his colleague found as reference as young people was named Martín Fierro. And so, but at the end of his life, he became, he had very bitter recollection of his times as a supporter of the Gaucho cult, because he thought there was a connection between criollista literature, the revision of Argentinian history, and Peronism, which he of course hated. So he once said that had Martín Fierro be alive in the 1940s, he would have been one of those horrible Peronists that he detested so much. So at the end of his life, he was very reluctant to appreciate criollista literature, which he did in his early days.
All right, well, thank you so much, Ezequiel and Chris and everybody for having participated in the first of our series of the Institute of Historical Research's Latin American History series. We invite everybody to join us in a fortnight, and we will be promoting our next speaker very soon. And yeah, thank you everybody for being here.
It was a pleasure for me. Thank you everybody for being there. Thank you for your questions and for the invitation.
Thank you everyone, and especially thank you to Ezequiel. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ezequiel. Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto. Gracias, Natalia. Gracias, Chris.
Es un gusto.